So thanks everyone for joining the fourth installment of the Edson Sustainability Series. So I'm Brennan Real, the Municipal Energy Coordinator. And today we're going to be discussing something a little closer to home than we have been in the previous presentations. We're going to be talking about climate change impacts in Alberta. Because usually when there's the discussion of climate change, it's always related to some other place, whether it's the melting of the Greenland ice sheets or flooding in Southeast Asia or droughts in California. But what I want to highlight in this discussion and presentation is that we're already experiencing the effects of climate change, whether we kind of see them or not. And I want to highlight those effects specifically in three places in Alberta. So it's in the Rockies, in the forests, and in Edson Area, because all of these places have experienced effects over the last 50, 60, 100 years, and they are noticeable and they are significant. So starting off with the Rockies, we're going to talk about one of the most important pieces and sort of the most visually striking pieces that highlight the climate change impacts, and that's on glaciers. So glaciers are always a concern when we're talking about climate change. And as I previously mentioned, there's a lot of talk about melting in the Greenland ice sheets and the Antarctic ice sheets, but we are experiencing that sort of major shifts closer to home. So there's about 1,100 glaciers in Alberta. We have a total volume of about 55 cubic kilometers, and we've seen massive changes in those over the last 100 years. And work is being done on this by what's called the Mountain Legacy Project. Now, what this project does is it takes images that were taken over 100 years ago during the initial surveys of the Rockies and are creating one-to-one recreations of these pictures to highlight the visual changes. So the first example we're looking at is the Robson Glacier up in Mount Robson Provincial Park. Now, this is a very significant glacier as it feeds the headwaters of the Fraser River, which flows all the way to the Fraser Valley, which supports about a population of around 300,000 people. So in 1911, when this picture was initially taken, the terminus of the glacier reached all the way to the glacial lake, which forms the headwaters of the river. And it was at its maximum at around 1780. And it's been in retreat ever since. So in 2011, we can see that the terminus of the glacier isn't even visible anymore. It's retreated about 1.5 kilometers up the glacial valley from the glacial lake, and this glacier has been receding at about 30 meters per year. So there's been a significant ice loss in that glacier. Now, closer to Edson and Jasper is the Athabasca Glacier, which is calved off of the Columbia ice field. In 1917, when these surveying pictures were taken, the terminus of the glacier would have crossed where the Icefields Parkway Highway is right now. So, and it was a very significant glacier and is a very massive ice field. In 2011, when the recreation was taken, we can see that the glacier has retreated of about 1.5 kilometers away from its maximum. And it's been retreating at a rate of about 5 to 10 meters per year. And since about the mid 1800s, the glacier itself has lost about half of its volume. Now, this is significant specifically from the Athabasca Glacier and the Columbia ice field, because this is one of the most significant ice fields in the Canadian Rockies. It has 8 major glaciers calving off of it, and it feeds 4 major river systems. So the North Saskatchewan, the Athabasca River, the Fraser River, and the Columbia River, which millions of people rely on for water supply. And recent research has shown that since 1985, the Columbia ice field has lost about 18% of its coverage area. And that's just in area. I wasn't able to find reliable data on how much volume has been lost out of it. But even with that loss of area coverage, trends in the Athabasca River has shown that annual flow rates are declining. So there's a significant effect downstream from these ice losses in the Canadian Rockies. Now, it's not just the Rockies that are being affected, it's Alberta's forests that are changing as well. And which is significant because that 61% of Alberta is covered in forest, and only about 15% of that is protected land. Now, there's lots of effects we could talk about when it comes to climate change in forests. So specifically, increased forest fires, changes in land use due to changes in climate. But the one I want to discuss that is the most visually striking and what some researchers are calling is the most potentially damaging in the long term. And that effect is the current infestation of mountain pine beetles that we're experiencing. So this picture here is showing Pyramid Lake up by Jasper, and every orange tree that we're seeing is a beetle-killed tree. So we're currently in a massive beetle infestation that has migrated out of BC into Alberta. And it's reached as far north as Jasper National Park and is slowly moving towards Hinton. And for anyone who's been up near Maligne Lake in the last few years, specifically around Medicine Lake, you can see the effects of that infestation because the forests there are very devastated from this sort of growth in beetle population. Now, the historical range, it was usually contained within BC and Vancouver Island, but since the 2000s, it's expanded up past Slave Lake and up to Fort Nelson, and mountain pine beetles have been detected as far east as Fort McMurray and Cold Lake. And this has been driven by rising temperatures and warmer winters. Now, specifically in outbreak areas in the 1999, it was related to central BC, but it has since expanded and migrated considerably into Alberta, and it's to the point where we're seeing up to 10 million hectares of land affected by this infestation. And as I'd mentioned, warmer winters are not stopping the spread of the mountain pine beetle. That cold winters are what's required to contain these insects. Now, research from the Canadian Forest Service has concluded that rising temperatures has allowed the beetles to expand their territory beyond their historical range, which is contributing heavily to the infestation and destruction of the boreal forests. Now, specifically in the Jasper area, where the beetles have recently expanded into, since 1950, there's been an average annual temperature increase of about 1 degree Celsius, which may not seem very significant, but in terms of an overall annual climate, that is incredibly significant. That sort of warming is only seen in the range of thousands of years, whereas we've seen that in the last 50 years. But it's not so much the annual temperatures that are affecting the spread of the mountain pine beetles. It's the reduction in winter days and cold winters. So what I'm showing here in this graphic is the annual amount of days in the Jasper area that is colder than -15. So, and since 1950, there's been a 14% decrease in cold winter days less than -15 degrees Celsius. And that's expected to continue to decrease as we move forward in this century. And these sort of changes aren't just limited to the Jasper area or any other place around the Rockies. We're seeing that in the Edson area as well. So what are the effects that we're seeing here? What we're seeing is rising annual temperatures, more heat waves, and the potential for more heat waves in the future. The average annual temperature in the Edson area has increased about 1.1 degrees Celsius since 1950, and is expected to increase by about another 2 degrees Celsius by 2050 if we continue with the business as usual emissions worldwide. So 1.1 degrees Celsius doesn't seem like it's that much overall. What's more significant from this rise is extreme weather events. So specifically heat waves and the hot season, which is any temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. In 1950, the town of Edson experienced 12 days above 30 degrees Celsius. In 2020, we experienced 26 days, and that trend is expected to continue, where by 2050, we will see a doubling of the amount of days above 30 degrees Celsius. And given the summer that we've had already, it's not hard to imagine what these future heat waves will look like because we've experienced those sort of things. So specifically, the massive heat wave that we experienced from June 25th to July 2nd in the affected area of Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest of the United States, 219 daily maximum temperature records were broken in that 1 week span. And on June 29th, Edson hit its highest ever recorded temperature of 38.6 degrees Celsius, which is absolutely incredibly hot. Now, heat waves are normal. Those things do happen in our climate. So what does climate change have to do with this? Now, the World Weather Attribution released a study on July 7th, analyzing the heat wave using multiple climate models. Now, the World Weather Attribution is a collaboration organization between multiple universities worldwide, which studies extreme weather events using climate models to determine the impact that climate change has on these events. And what they concluded is the heat wave that we experienced was virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. And an event of this magnitude would be 150 times rarer without human-induced climate change. So it's taken what would be normally a 1 in 150,000 year heat event and translated it into a 1 in 1,000 year event. And so the effect that we've had on our climate so far has just ratcheted up these sort of events. And what their prediction for the future is something even more significant. So what they concluded was an event like this, which is currently estimated to occur only once every 1,000 years, would occur roughly every 5 to 10 years in a future world with 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And this is especially poignant because on average, we've already experienced a 1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius increase in average temperatures worldwide. So what can once be considered a freak event would now become a cyclical part of our climate. So that all leaves the question is, where do we go from here? And I won't dive too much into this because that would eat up a massive amount of time. We could spend hours discussing where do we go from here. There's typically a 3-point path that we can take to mitigate these changes, increase resilience, and apply adaptation to it. Mitigation is just continuing the work that we're doing to reduce our emissions, to reduce our impact on the environment. Resilience is building up systems that allow us to weather these sort of events and these climatic changes so that we can come out stronger on the other side. And adaptation is designing our systems, our buildings, our operations with future climate change in mind, knowing that there will be future changes in average temperatures, heat waves, precipitation, that sort of thing, and building our systems around that. Now, I know this presentation might have been kind of a bummer considering it's showing sort of environmental degradation due to climate change. And I think this stuff is very important to discuss and look into because we are seeing the effects already in our environment and in our local areas. That climate change isn't something that's happening across the world or to someone else. We're seeing it here and right now. And I think there's a lot of hope that we can actively adapt, be resilient, and mitigate this based on what we're currently doing in the town. And I'm excited to see what happens. So thank you guys for your attention, and we can open the floor up to any questions or discussion here.